Timothy was a young man whose simple life became a powerful example of faith and dedication. Raised in the midst of two distinct cultures, he stood out for his courage and willingness to answer God's call, even in the face of challenges that seemed greater than he could handle. Throughout his life, Timothy faced opposition, pressure, and even his own physical weaknesses. But at every step, he showed himself to be an example of obedience and trust in God. More than that, he was living proof that when we respond to the divine call, our limitations become opportunities for God's strength to reveal itself. This is Timothy's story, an account that inspires, challenges, and reminds us that God's purpose never fails. It is a story of faith, courage, and fidelity that even centuries later still speaks to our hearts. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Lystra was a peaceful city, almost forgotten in time, where the hills seemed to whisper ancient secrets in the wind. It was there that Timothy was born, into a home marked by contrasts. His father, a Greek with a rational spirit, looked at life with pragmatism, while his mother, Eunice, carried the flame of the Jewish faith in her heart. Eunice, in turn, had learned about the divine promises from Lois, her mother, and together they formed a strong bond, weaving sacred stories in little Timothy's soul. From an early age, Timothy looked different. He was not just an attentive boy. It was as if he had an internal lighthouse that guided him to something beyond the ordinary. While other children ran through the dusty streets, he sat at the feet of his mother and grandmother, listening with shining eyes to accounts of God's great deeds. It was a childhood that, at first glance, seemed simple, but was actually being shaped by the extraordinary. His home, a mosaic of cultures, echoed both the wisdom of the Greeks and Jewish prophecies. Timothy lived between these two realities, like a thread that united opposing worlds. When his mother recited the Psalms, he could feel something vibrating in his spirit, as if each word had been written especially for him. It was impossible not to notice that something bigger was being planted there, even if he still didn't understand what it was. As the days passed, his life continued in silence, like the waters of a river that flow calmly before meeting the rapids. But in that calm, God was already acting, weaving the first threads of destiny that would lead him to a transformative encounter. The years passed, and Timothy grew up. His face still had the serene expression of someone trying to understand the world around him, but there was something about him that caught the attention of everyone in Lystra. He was young, yes, but his maturity was impressive. Anyone who saw him at Christian community meetings could feel that his faith was not just a repetition of what he had learned from his mother and grandmother. No, it was something deeper, like a tree that takes root beyond the visible, seeking the waters that feed the invisible. Timothy was known for his kindness and a calmness that seemed to contradict the intensity of his dedication. When he spoke, his words resonated like well-composed music, reflecting not only knowledge, but also wisdom. It was not difficult for the community's elders to recognize that there was a special mark on him, as if he carried within him a radiance that did not come from this world. Christians who visited Lystra always left with something to say about the young man. He had become a kind of reference point, a flame that kept the community warm in difficult times. But Timothy, with all his quietness and humility, never saw himself that way. For him, faith was like a trail to be followed, and he just took it one step at a time, without imagining where the path would take him. It was in this context that he began to hear stories about a man named Paulo, a bold missionary who traveled from city to city, preaching about the Messiah with a passion that changed everything wherever he went. Timothy, intrigued, imagined what it would be like to find someone like that, someone who seemed to carry a fire similar to the one that burned in his heart. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, the unexpected happened. The day dawned like any other in Lystra. The market was buzzing with voices, the smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, and residents went about their routines. Timothy, as always, was at home, helping Eunice with the chores and listening attentively to some passage that his mother was reading aloud. But that day, something different would happen. The news arrived quickly, like fire in dry straw. Paulo, the missionary so many talked about, was in the city. He had arrived accompanied by Silas, bringing stories about healings, miracles, and words that shook the most hardened souls. Paulo's presence in the main square caused a buzz. People gathered, curious, some with skepticism, others with hope written on their faces. Timothy, overcome by a curiosity he could barely contain, decided to go there. Upon seeing Paul, Timothy did not just see an ordinary preacher. There was something about the man that left him speechless, as if his very presence carried the force of thunder. Paulo spoke with passion, his voice cutting through the air like blades that revealed the deepest truths. He spoke of Jesus, the Messiah, the Savior. For Timothy, each word seemed like an echo of what he already felt in his heart, but had never been able to express. When Paul's gaze met Timothy's, something indescribable happened. It was as if the missionary saw in him not only the young man who was there, but the potential that God had planted from the beginning. Paul saw the living faith of Eunice and Lois shining in this young man, but also something even deeper, an unwavering willingness to follow God's calling, no matter the cost. After finishing preaching, Paul approached Timothy. The moment was simple, but loaded with meaning. Between a few words exchanged, it became clear that this meeting was much more than a coincidence. It was the beginning of a journey that would change their lives forever. The encounter with Paul left Timothy uneasy. It wasn't just admiration, it was as if an invisible bell had been rung in his soul, calling him to something greater. As people went back to their routines, he remained thoughtful, like someone who, when looking at the horizon, realizes that there is much more beyond what meets the eye. It didn't take long for Paulo to look for him again, this time with a proposal that would change everything. With a firm but affectionate conversation, Paul made it clear that he saw a special purpose in Timothy. He didn't just speak with words, but with his eyes, the eyes of someone who had already suffered for the sake of Christ and knew how to recognize someone who was willing to do the same. Timothy felt the weight of that responsibility, but at the same time, there was an inexplicable peace, as if he had finally found the path he had always been looking for. However, there was one detail that needed to be addressed. Although his mother was Jewish, and he was raised according to the scriptures, the fact that his father was Greek posed a certain challenge. Paul knew that to avoid conflict and facilitate ministry among the Jews, Timothy would need to be circumcised. It was a demand that seemed harsh, but Timothy did not hesitate. His answer was simple: he would do whatever it took to serve. This act of obedience and surrender was like a seal of his willingness. Timothy was not just an apprentice. He was a spiritual son of Paul, someone who shared not only the teaching, but also the mission. From that moment on, he was no longer the shy young man from Lystra. Under Paul's guidance, Timothy would begin to travel unknown lands, face dangers, and above all, witness the transforming power of the gospel. With Paul, he took his first steps outside Lystra. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Timothy was not afraid. There was something bigger waiting, and the journey was just beginning. With the dust of the road rising beneath his feet, Timothy began to experience the world beyond Lystra. Alongside Paulo, he became part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Each city they entered was a new opportunity to see the gospel in action, but also a reminder that following Christ came with challenges. At every step, Timothy found himself confronted with the reality of a faith that was not just words, but life, courage, and often sacrifice. In Philippi, he witnessed something he would never forget. Paulo and Silas, when freeing a possessed young woman, faced the fury of the residents. They were arrested and flogged. Timothy saw up close the marks of pain on the bodies of those who guided him, and even so, he heard chants echoing from the prison. That unshakable faith ignited something in his heart. He understood that following Christ was walking in the light, even when everything around him seemed dark. From Philippi to Thessalonica and then to Berea, the young disciple began to understand the challenges of ministry. It wasn't just preaching, it was listening, consoling, teaching, and sometimes running away from angry crowds. In Berea, he saw how some eagerly sought the scriptures, while in Thessalonica, rejection and persecution forced them to leave in haste. Each city seemed to carry its own mystery, a mix of acceptance and resistance. Timothy not only observed but participated. He carried messages, strengthened his brothers in the faith, and helped Paul in everything he could. Even as the pressure mounted, his determination grew. Amidst the chaos, he discovered that there was a strength within him that he didn't know he possessed. It was like a lit torch, guiding him along paths that, although dangerous, were filled with purpose. It was on this journey, full of ups and downs, that Paul began to trust Timothy with more and more responsibilities. When Paul entrusted Timothy with leadership of the church in Ephesus, many raised their eyebrows. After all, he was too young for such a big task. Ephesus was not just any city, it was a busy metropolis, full of challenges. The local church faced heresy, internal conflicts, and constant pressure from the surrounding world. For any leader, it would be a heavy burden, but for Timothy, it seemed almost impossible. Almost. He arrived with an anxious heart, but full of faith. The streets of Ephesus pulsed with the sound of merchants, travelers, and devotees of the Temple of Artemis, which dominated the landscape like an imposing shadow. Timothy knew he was not just caring for a congregation. I was defending a truth that many did not want to hear. Still, he didn't back down. The courage he had learned alongside Paulo now needed to be put into practice. At first, it wasn't easy. Some questioned his youth. Others felt he didn't have enough experience to lead. But Timothy, firm as a rock that resists the waves, remembered Paul's words. "Let no one despise you because you are young, but be an example to the believers." He didn't just preach. He lived what he taught, showing day after day that his age was not an obstacle to the power of God to act. Still, the fights were constant. There were false teachers who spread deceptive doctrines like weeds in the field of faith. Timothy needed to be firm, but also wise. He used scripture as his sword and love as his armor. Every day his confidence grew, not in himself, but in the one who had called him. As he handled responsibilities in Ephesus, Paul's letters became his greatest support. They were like anchors in the midst of the storms, reminding him that he was not alone. Paul's letters arrived like precious gifts, full of words that sparked hope and brought direction. In each line, Timothy could hear the firm and at the same time loving voice of his mentor, as if Paul were there, sitting next to him, guiding him through the challenges of Ephesus. But as I read, I also felt the growing weight of responsibility. Paul didn't just encourage, he warned of the dangers that would come, the wolves in sheep's clothing that would try to devour the flock. Among the words that echoed most in his mind was a direct call, "Revive the gift within you." Timothy knew exactly what Paul was talking about. He remembered the moment when hands were laid on his head when he was consecrated to the ministry. There was a flame within him, but Paulo seemed to fear that the winds of difficulties would extinguish it. So every morning, Timothy prayed that that flame would remain burning, even when everything around him seemed to conspire against him. Timothy also faced another challenge, his health. Paul's words, suggesting that he take better care of himself, showed that the young pastor faced not only spiritual struggles, but also physical ones. However, Timothy didn't let that stop him. He kept going. Even when tiredness threatened to overcome him, his strength came from a place beyond his body. It came from the certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Meanwhile, pressure in Ephesus was increasing. Heresies seemed to grow like shadows that spread across the church. Each new problem required more wisdom and courage from Timothy. He knew he couldn't face everything alone. Therefore, he remained faithful to prayer and the word, constantly seeking God's direction. But there was something else going on. Paul, from where he was, seemed to sense that his days were coming to an end, and his words carried a tone of urgency. Timothy felt like something bigger was about to happen, something that would test his faith like never before. The news arrived like a stone thrown into the water, causing ripples to spread quickly. Paul was arrested again in Rome, this time under even darker circumstances. Timothy, upon hearing this, felt a pang in his heart. He knew that Paulo, his mentor and friend, was no stranger to prison, but this time there was something different. The letters that came from Rome were filled with a tone he had never seen before. There was an urgency, a silent farewell between the lines. While leading the church in Ephesus, Timothy continued to struggle with local difficulties, but his mind often wandered to Paul. He could imagine the apostle sitting in a cold cell, surrounded by darkness, and yet writing with unshakable conviction. Paul's words were like a torch passed to Timothy. "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith." It was impossible not to feel the weight of these statements, as if the baton itself were being handed into his hands. Timothy wanted to be with Paul, but distance and responsibilities kept him trapped. However, he never felt so close to his mentor. Each battle he faced in Ephesus seemed to be an extension of Paul's mission, a continuation of the work they had begun together. There were nights when Timothy, alone in his prayer, could almost hear Paul's voice, telling him not to give up. Meanwhile, pressure in Rome was mounting. Timothy knew that the persecution of Christians was intensifying and that Paul's name was a target of hatred. Anguish accompanied him, but also a certainty. He needed to maintain the legacy of the gospel, no matter the cost. And even with the daily struggles in Ephesus, something deep in his heart said that he could not ignore the call to be with Paul one last time. The wind was cold as Timothy crossed the roads that would take him to Rome. He had made the decision, even though he knew that leaving Ephesus could be risky. Heresies still threatened the church. Challenges were constant, but something inside him said he needed to go. Paul's words in his last letter echoed like an impossible-to-ignore call, "Come quickly, before the winter." Timothy knew it wasn't just about the approaching season, but about the time that seemed to slip away quickly. The journey was long and full of dangers. Timothy found Roman soldiers patrolling the roads, hearing rumors about the persecution of Christians that was increasing every day. In each village he stopped at, he felt the weight of insecurity, but none of that made him back down. He remembered Paul's teachings about courage and faith and moved forward, determined to arrive before it was too late. When he finally saw Rome, the city didn't look like the stories he had heard. The grandeur of the place was overshadowed by the dark atmosphere of tension and fear. The persecution of Christ's followers was intense, and Paul's name was spoken in whispers. Timothy did his best to remain unnoticed as he headed to the place where his mentor was being held. Each step seemed fraught with anxiety, but also with a silent hope that he might still hear Paulo's voice once again. Upon arrival, he was taken to the cell where Paulo was. The sight of his mentor left him speechless. Paulo seemed weaker, more worn out by time and suffering, but his eyes shone with the same passion as always. The reunion was silent at first, but full of meaning. Timothy felt that this moment was a gift, an opportunity to receive more than words, but the very spirit of faith and perseverance that Paul carried. The cell was cold, but the room was warmed by the presence of two souls who shared an unbreakable bond. Timothy listened attentively to Paul, absorbing every word as if it were his last. There was something in Paulo's tone that mixed serenity and urgency. He spoke about the struggle of faith, about the price of following Christ, but also about the glory that awaited those who persevered. His words were not of lament, but of someone who knew he was about to cross the boundary between the temporal and the eternal. Timothy felt the weight of that moment. He wasn't just listening to a mentor. I was witnessing the closure of a life that had been completely surrendered to God's purpose. Paul's physical weakness contrasted with the strength of his words, which resounded like thunder in a silent night. The young man knew that from now on, he would carry not only the memories of Paulo, but also the mission they had shared. When the time came to leave, Timothy did so with a heavy heart, but with new determination. Paul had completed his course, but Timothy's journey was just beginning. He returned to Ephesus, taking with him the weight of everything he had experienced, but also an even stronger flame, lit by his mentor's last words. The days in Rome were a milestone in his life, but they were not the end of his challenges. Timothy continued to lead, face persecution, and keep alive the message that Paul was so dedicated to proclaiming. Even in moments of loneliness and weakness, he knew he was not alone. The seeds planted by Paul and watered by God would flourish in his life, making him a symbol of faithfulness and courage. And so Timothy's story remains alive, not only in the pages of Scripture, but also in the hearts of all who seek to serve God with perseverance, reminding us that the divine calling is always accompanied by challenges, but also by a strength that only He can give. Timothy's life was not marked by great deeds that caught the attention of men, but by the constancy in following the purpose given to him. He did not seek the spotlight, but remained faithful to his calling, even in the most difficult times. The young man who began as Paul's apprentice became a steadfast leader, a loving shepherd, and a voice that echoed truth in times of confusion. His story is a reminder that God does not choose the strongest or the most prepared, but those willing to trust and obey. The years that followed after Paul's death were not easy. Timothy faced even more intense persecution, but he never strayed from the path. He continued to preach, teach, and care for the flock entrusted to him. Some traditions suggest that he faced martyrdom, defending his faith until his last breath. Others believe that he lived to a ripe old age, always faithful to his calling. Whatever the outcome, one thing is certain: his life was a living testimony to God's power to transform the ordinary into extraordinary. And what can we learn from it? Timothy teaches us that it doesn't matter who we are or where we come from. What matters is the willingness to respond to God's call. He shows us that true strength is not in the absence of fear, but in the courage to move forward even when everything seems difficult. His faithfulness, even in trials, reminds us that God walks alongside those who trust in Him. Timothy also teaches us the value of having spiritual mentors, people who guide us and prepare us to face life's challenges with wisdom. Just like Paul, we are called to learn, but also to pass on what we receive. Her story is an invitation to live with purpose, knowing that in the end, what matters is not the size of the challenges, but the fidelity with which we face them. If you liked Timothy's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.